They say love makes you blind, but what happens when it makes you bankrupt? When the woman who promised you forever disappears with everything you've worked your entire life to build. This is the story of Robert Chen, a 62-year-old retired construction foreman from Manchester, who thought he'd found his second chance at happiness. Instead, he discovered that some predators wear the most beautiful masks. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will shock and educate you. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Robert had always been a simple man with simple pleasures. For 37 years, he'd built houses, saved every penny he could, and dreamed of a quiet retirement with his wife Margaret in their modest home in Stockport. They'd planned trips to the Lake District, visits to see their grandchildren in Australia, maybe even a cruise around the Mediterranean. But cancer is merciless, and Margaret's battle ended on a cold February morning in 2019, leaving Robert alone with memories and a pension fund worth just over £200,000. The first year of widowhood nearly broke him. Friends tried to help, but Robert couldn't shake the feeling that his life was over. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of ghosts. His daughter Sarah lived in Sydney with her family, calling every Sunday, but unable to bridge the vast ocean of loneliness that had swallowed her father whole. Robert's days blended into a grey routine of morning tea, afternoon television, and evening walks through neighborhoods where every corner held memories of Margaret. It was during one of those walks that Mrs. Patterson from next door mentioned online dating. "Robert, love, you can't spend the rest of your life talking to Margaret's photograph," she said gently. "She wouldn't want that for you." The suggestion horrified him at first. How could he even think about replacing Margaret? But as the months dragged on, the silence in his house became unbearable. Late one night, fueled by loneliness and a glass of whiskey, Robert created a profile on an international dating site. He wasn't looking for anything serious, he told himself. Just conversation, maybe some companionship, someone to share a meal with occasionally. Robert posted a single photo of himself from Sarah's wedding 5 years earlier, when Margaret was still healthy and he still smiled regularly. His profile was honest to a fault. Recently widowed, retired, living alone, looking for friendship, and maybe something more with the right person. The responses trickled in slowly at first. A few local women his age, widows themselves, reaching out with careful messages about shared experiences and mutual understanding. Robert exchanged polite emails with several of them, even met 2 for coffee in town. They were nice enough, but something was missing. The spark, the excitement, the feeling that his heart might actually beat faster again. Then Lila's message arrived like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Her profile picture showed a stunning woman with long black hair and warm brown eyes, sitting in what looked like a cafe in Manila. She was 38, she said, a nurse working in the Philippines, taking care of her elderly mother and dreaming of a better life. Her English was imperfect but charming, peppered with endearing mistakes that made Robert smile for the first time in months. "Hello, Robert," her first message read. "I see your photo and think you have kind eyes. I am sorry for your wife loss. I understand lonely feeling because I am also alone now. My husband died in an accident 3 years before. Maybe we can be friends and help each other not feel so alone." Robert stared at that message for 20 minutes before responding. Something about Lila's vulnerability, her genuine warmth, drew him in. Here was someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to rebuild a life from ashes. Their correspondence began cautiously, sharing stories about their late spouses, their struggles with loneliness, their hopes for whatever future might still be possible. Within weeks, their daily emails became the highlight of Robert's existence. Lila shared photos of her life in Manila, the small apartment she shared with her mother, the hospital where she worked long shifts for little pay, the simple meals she cooked on a hot plate. Robert found himself looking forward to her messages with an intensity that surprised and slightly frightened him. She called him "My dear Robert" and signed every email with "Sending you my heart." The first video call happened on a Sunday evening in October. Robert had bought a new laptop specifically for this moment, spending hours figuring out how to use the webcam software. When Lila's face appeared on his screen, animated and real and absolutely beautiful, his hand shook so badly he nearly knocked over his tea. She wore a simple white blouse, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. But to Robert, she was the most gorgeous woman he'd ever seen. "Robert, you are more handsome than your picture," she said, covering her mouth as she giggled. "I'm so nervous to see you." They talked for 3 hours that first night. Lila told him about her childhood in a small fishing village, how she'd worked her way through nursing school, how she'd married young to a man who turned out to be controlling and abusive before his death in a motorcycle accident. She spoke about her mother's diabetes, the expensive medications she couldn't afford, the dreams she'd given up to become a caregiver. Robert found himself opening up in ways he hadn't since Margaret's death. He told her about his childhood in working-class Manchester, about meeting Margaret at a church dance when they were both 19, about building their life together brick by brick. He confessed his fears about growing old alone, about becoming irrelevant and forgotten. "You are not forgotten," Lila said softly, her eyes glistening with tears that seemed utterly genuine. "You are remembered by me now. We remember each other." Their relationship deepened with frightening speed. Daily emails became twice daily video calls. Lila began calling Robert "my love" and "my future husband," terms that should have set off alarm bells, but instead filled him with a warmth he thought he'd never feel again. She shared intimate details about her life, her fears, her dreams of leaving the Philippines for a better future in England. The first warning sign came disguised as the emergency. 6 weeks into their relationship, Lila called him crying, barely coherent with panic. Her mother had collapsed at home and was in the hospital. The doctors said she needed surgery immediately, but the cost was astronomical by Philippine standards. £1,500 would save her mother's life, but Lila had nothing left after paying for previous medical bills. "I'm so ashamed to ask," she sobbed into the camera, "but I have no one else. My mother is dying, Robert. I cannot lose her too." Robert's rational mind whispered warnings, but his heart was already reaching for his wallet. This was the woman he loved, the woman who'd brought light back into his dark world. How could he let her mother die when he had the power to help? The transfer took less than 10 minutes online. Lila's tears of gratitude, her promises to pay him back as soon as possible, her declarations of eternal love, all seemed worth every penny. The pattern established itself gradually, so subtly that Robert didn't recognize it until much later. Every few weeks, there was another crisis. Lila's apartment lease was suddenly terminated by a greedy landlord. Her job at the hospital was threatened unless she could pay for additional certification courses. Her mother needed new medication that insurance wouldn't cover. Each emergency was presented with tears, panic, and desperate gratitude when Robert inevitably came to the rescue. But it wasn't just about money, Lila insisted. She was planning to visit him in England, to finally meet in person and begin their real life together. She'd started the visa application process, she said, but it was expensive and complicated. There were fees for documents, interviews, travel arrangements. Each step cost money, and each step brought them closer to being together forever. Robert began liquidating investments to fund their future. First the stocks Margaret had left him, then the bonds they'd bought for their retirement. Each transfer to Lila felt like an investment in their shared happiness. She sent him photos constantly. Selfies from her hospital shifts. Pictures of meals she'd cooked thinking of him. Snapshots of places in Manila where she imagined taking him when he visited. The intimacy between them grew more intense with each passing month. Their video calls became deeply personal, with Lila sharing private moments and vulnerable confessions that made Robert feel like the most important man in the world. She showed him the small altar she'd created in her bedroom with their photo together. Talked about the wedding dress she was secretly saving money to buy. Described the children she hoped they might adopt since she couldn't have biological children due to complications from a previous surgery. Robert began planning a trip to Manila for Christmas. He wanted to meet Lila's mother, to see the places she'd shown him in photos, to finally hold the woman who'd saved him from his own loneliness. But every time he mentioned booking flights, Lila found reasons to delay. Her mother's health was too fragile for visitors. The hospital was demanding more of her time. She wanted to lose weight before he saw her in person. Better to wait until after the holidays when things were calmer. Instead, she suggested he could help her with the visa process more effectively if some of their financial arrangements were formalized. If her bank accounts showed more stability, the British Embassy would be more likely to approve her application. It made sense to Robert, who knew nothing about immigration law but trusted Lila completely. He began transferring larger amounts, helping her establish the financial foundation that would bring her to England permanently. The joint account was Lila's idea, presented as a romantic gesture of their commitment to each other. When couples marry, they share everything, she said during one of their late-night calls. This shows the embassy we are serious, that our love is real. Robert added her name to his main savings account and gave her access to the funds that represented 40 years of careful financial planning. By spring, Robert had sent or provided access to nearly his entire nest egg. His pension payments were being deposited directly into the joint account that Lila managed from Manila. She sent him monthly statements showing how she was investing their money, saving for their future home together, building the foundation for their new life. Everything looked legitimate, professional, promising. The video calls became less frequent in April. Lila explained that she was working double shifts to save money for her trip to England, that her mother's health was demanding more attention, that the visa process was consuming all her free time. When they did speak, she seemed distracted, tired, less focused on their intimate conversations, but she assured Robert that everything was progressing perfectly, that their reunion was just weeks away. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Robert's daughter Sarah, calling from Sydney with concern in her voice that he'd never heard before. She'd been trying to send him money for his birthday and discovered that his bank account had been frozen due to suspicious international transactions. When she'd called the bank for more information, they told her that Robert's account showed signs of potential fraud. "Dad, they're saying someone in the Philippines has been withdrawing large amounts of money," Sarah said carefully. They want you to come in immediately to discuss your account activity. Dad, what's going on? Robert's hands trembled as he hung up the phone. There had to be a mistake. Lila was managing their money, but she was investing it, saving it for their future together. She would never steal from him. She loved him. She was planning to marry him. This was just a banking error, a computer glitch, something that could be easily explained. He tried calling Lila immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He sent urgent emails and messages through the dating site, explaining the banking situation and asking her to contact him immediately. Hours passed without a response. Then a day, then 2 days of absolute silence from the woman who had spoken to him every single day for the past 8 months. The meeting at the bank was devastating. Robert sat across from a sympathetic but firm financial advisor who showed him transaction records that painted a horrifying picture. Over the past 6 months, nearly £200,000 had been withdrawn from his accounts. The money had been transferred to multiple accounts in the Philippines and Malaysia, then quickly moved to untraceable locations. Mr. Chen, I'm afraid you've been the victim of what we call a romance scam, the advisor said gently. The person you've been communicating with has systematically emptied your accounts. The patterns we're seeing here are unfortunately very common in these types of crimes. Subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below. Have you or anyone you know ever experienced something similar? How did you handle it? Your stories help others recognize and avoid these devastating situations. Robert stumbled out of the bank, feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. Everything he'd believed about his relationship with Lila, everything he'd felt and hoped and planned, had been built on lies. The woman he loved didn't exist. The photos, the tears, the intimate conversations, the promises of forever, all of it had been an elaborate performance designed to separate him from his life savings. He drove home through familiar streets that suddenly looked alien and threatening. How could he have been so stupid? How could he have fallen for something so obvious in retrospect? Margaret would have seen through Lila's deception in minutes. Margaret would have protected their nest egg, their security, their future. But Margaret was gone, and Robert had been easy prey for someone who made a living exploiting lonely old men. The house that had felt empty without Margaret now felt like a prison. Robert sat in his kitchen, staring at the laptop where he'd spent countless hours talking to a woman who never existed, and tried to comprehend the magnitude of his loss. It wasn't just the money, though. That was devastating enough. It was the betrayal of trust, the destruction of hope, the realization that his judgment was so compromised by loneliness that he'd willingly handed over everything he owned to a stranger. He tried reaching out to the dating site for help, but they could only confirm what he already knew. The profile for Lila Martinez was fake, created with stolen photos and a fabricated biography designed to appeal to vulnerable widowers like himself. The customer service representative was polite but matter-of-fact. This happened hundreds of times every day, targeting people who were grieving, isolated, desperate for connection. The shame was almost unbearable. Robert couldn't bring himself to call Sarah back. Couldn't imagine admitting to his daughter that he lost her inheritance to an online scammer. He couldn't face his neighbors, his few remaining friends, the people who would inevitably find out that he'd been taken for a fool by someone half his age, living on the other side of the world. For weeks, Robert barely left his house. He cancelled his internet service, threw away the laptop, disconnected from the digital world that had betrayed him so completely. Food lost its taste. Sleep became elusive. The future, that had seemed so bright with Lila, now appeared as a void of poverty and isolation stretching endlessly ahead. The first breakthrough came when Sarah showed up unannounced at his door. Having flown from Sydney, the moment she realized the extent of his situation. Robert had never been so ashamed in his life, but his daughter's reaction surprised him. Instead of anger or judgment, she wrapped him in a fierce hug and told him that loving someone wasn't a crime, even when that someone turned out to be false. "Dad, you're not the first person this has happened to, and you won't be the last," she said as they sat in the kitchen where Robert had once dreamed of introducing Lila to his family. "These people are professionals. They know exactly how to target. Someone who's grieving, someone who's lonely. You weren't stupid. You were human." Sarah had researched romance scams during her flight to Manchester, preparing herself for what she might find. The statistics were staggering. Billions of dollars lost every year to criminals who specialized in exploiting emotional vulnerability. The average victim was exactly like Robert, recently widowed or divorced, financially comfortable, isolated from family and friends, desperate for companionship in their later years. Together, they reported the fraud to the police. Though the detective was frank about the likelihood of recovering any money, the scammers had moved the funds through multiple countries with banking secrecy laws, making recovery nearly impossible. They could open an investigation, but Robert should prepare himself for the reality that his pension was gone forever. The legal proceedings were humiliating but necessary. Robert had to recount every detail of his relationship with Lila to investigators who had heard similar stories hundreds of times before. He had to admit to sending intimate photos, sharing personal details, making promises of marriage to someone he'd never met in person. Each revelation felt like another layer of his dignity being stripped away. But slowly, painfully, Robert began to rebuild. Sarah extended her visa and stayed with him for 2 months, helping him navigate the practical aspects of his new reality. They downsized his expenses, applied for additional government benefits, explored options for supplementing his now meager income. The house would need to be sold eventually, but for now, Robert could survive on a much smaller budget if he was careful. More importantly, Sarah helped him reconnect with the world beyond his computer screen. They visited old friends Robert had neglected during his months of obsession with Lila. They took walks through places he'd shared with Margaret, reclaiming memories that had been overshadowed by his online romance. Gradually, Robert began to remember who he was before loneliness had made him vulnerable to predators. The hardest part was learning to trust his own judgment again. Every emotion, every attraction, every moment of hope now came with the question, is this real, or am I being manipulated again? Robert joined a support group for fraud victims, where he met others who had lost everything to similar scams. Hearing their stories helped him understand that his experience wasn't unique, that intelligent, caring people fell victim to these crimes every day. Some of the group members had lost even more than Robert. A retired teacher named Margaret, the shared name felt like a sign, had lost over £300,000 to a man claiming to be a widowed surgeon working with Doctors Without Borders. A former engineer named David had sold his house and moved to Thailand to marry a woman who disappeared the day he arrived in Bangkok. Their stories were heartbreaking, but their resilience was inspiring. Robert learned that recovery wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming his sense of self-worth and his ability to form genuine connections with real people. He began volunteering at a local charity that helped elderly people with technology, teaching them how to recognize online scams. Sharing his experience, helping others avoid his mistakes, gave him a sense of purpose that he'd lost when Lila disappeared. 18 months after the scam, Robert met Janet at the charity where they both volunteered. She was 70, a retired librarian whose husband had died of a heart attack 3 years earlier. They bonded over their shared experiences with loss, their love of books, their commitment to helping other seniors navigate the digital world safely. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, built on real interactions and genuine compatibility, rather than desperate loneliness and false promises. Janet had her own story of online deception. She'd been targeted by romance scammers multiple times, but had recognized the warning signs early, thanks to education from her tech-savvy granddaughter. She helped Robert see that his experience with Lila, while devastating, had also made him more aware, more cautious, better equipped to recognize genuine emotion from practiced manipulation. They started as friends, then slowly became something more. Robert found himself capable of love again, but this time it was grounded in reality. He and Janet shared meals, attended community events, traveled on modest day trips within England. They talked about their late spouses without guilt, supported each other through difficult moments, built a relationship based on mutual respect and authentic connection. The financial recovery was slower and less complete. Robert never got his pension money back, despite ongoing investigations that occasionally yielded small victories against romance scam networks. He had to adjust to a much simpler lifestyle, but he discovered that happiness didn't require the comfortable retirement he'd originally planned. Sarah set up a small fund to help with emergencies, and Robert's volunteer work provided structure and meaning to his days. Most importantly, Robert learned to forgive himself. The shame that had consumed him for months gradually gave way to understanding. He had been targeted by professionals who made their living exploiting human vulnerability. His desire for companionship, his willingness to trust and love, weren't character flaws. They were human qualities that had been weaponized against him by people without conscience. Robert's story ends not with revenge or complete financial recovery, but with something more valuable: wisdom, genuine love, and the ability to help others avoid his mistakes. He speaks regularly at senior centers about online safety, shares his experience with support groups, and has helped dozens of people recognize the warning signs of romance scams before they lose everything. The house in Stockport has been sold, and Robert now lives in a modest flat near the charity where he volunteers. Janet has her own place nearby, and they spend most of their time together by choice rather than desperate need. They're planning a small wedding for next spring, a real celebration with real friends and family, built on a foundation of truth rather than beautiful lies. To anyone watching this who might be lonely, vulnerable, or seeking connection online, please remember Robert's story. Love should make you feel safe, not desperate. A real relationship builds gradually through shared experiences, not urgent crises that require immediate financial solutions. Trust your instincts, confide in friends and family, and remember that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Don't let loneliness make you an easy target for people who view your emotions as a business opportunity. There are genuine connections to be found, real love to be discovered, authentic companionship waiting for those brave enough to seek it safely. But please protect yourself first. Your security, your dignity, and your future are worth more than any beautiful lie. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories that educate and inform. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your voice might help someone else avoid a devastating mistake. And keep watching for more stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines. The human cost of modern crimes and the resilience of people who refuse to let betrayal define their future.